So today I introduce some of the concepts of eco-poetics or eco-aesthetics. So let us begin with the definition of eco-aesthetic or eco-poetics. It deals with the relationship between nature and human nature. Or if we theorize it, we may say that eco-poetics problematizes the relation between nature and human nature. Apparently, it may not be problematic. It appears to be very simple. But when we go deep into this relationship, we can see that this relationship is very complex, very difficult to understand, especially the subtleties of this relationship, the meticulous aspect of this relationship. That's why we consider it an attempt to problematize the apparently simple relationship between nature and human nature. So the first thing that come to our mind is how landscape, how nature, how geography influences our thinking process. Let us consider, for example, the state of Kerala. You know, Kerala in the map of India, it appears like a green ribbon entrapped between high ranges and the deep sea. A small strip on the southern part of India, a green ribbon. So it is entrapped between two borders. One is the high ranges and the blue deep, the Arabian Sea. And in between, there are several rivers crisscross between the two borders. And what is the impact of the proximity of the sea? The proximity of sea creates a sense of melancholy in Malayalam literature. There is a sense of melancholy. There is a sense of what is called a dirge. A sense of dirge is pervasive in the entire Malayalam literature. And this can be juxtaposed with the situation in the north. So there, the climate is extreme, whereas in Kerala, the climate is moderate. Moderate climate. Moderate climate influences people to avoid streams. There is no extremity of emotions or actions. People are moderate in their expressions, in their actions. That's not the case with a climate with extreme situations. So in the northern part of the India, there is a extreme climate. In certain sense, it is extreme. And also, historically, the northern India was pervaded with violence. The several invasions, foreign invasions, from the ancient Greeks to the contemporary nations, contemporary invasions of China or Pakistan, several invasions. So all the brutalities, violence of the invasions were suffered by the people of North India. Sufferings, consequent war, consequent invasions, consequent violence, an extreme climate, cold wave, heat wave, floods, and also strong winds. So certain types of extremities are visible in the words and actions of the people of North India. You can easily find this. I just suggest two novels for you. One is an Indian English novel by Ruth Brower Jawbala, Heat and Dust. Heat and Dust. So heat and dust itself suggests the extreme hot climate in certain parts of North India. How the physical heat and dust create an internal or emotional heat and dust in the people. And that can be juxtaposed with a novel like Anand's Alkutam. There is a moderation of emotions, moderation of action in the context of the moderation of the climate in Kerala. So, whatever be, or you can take, for example, a novelist, say a writer like S.K. Pottekkatt. S.K. Pottekkatt, for example, Vishaganyaka. In Vishaganyaka, so man's relationship with the land is discussed. There is a celebration of the rain. In Malayalam literature, there is a spirited celebration of the rain. In a contemporary poet, for example, in V.M. Girija's poetry about rain, you can see the erotic experience of rain. The sky caresses the land through the invisible hands, several invisible, millions of invisible hands of rains. An erotic experience. The havoc played by rain is always ignored in Malayalam literature. Of course, in Kerala there are floods, landslides, and tragedies. Tragedies did occur and often occur, but all these are ignored. And we celebrate rain, we celebrate environment, we celebrate see brimming rivers, we celebrate the wind from the Arabian Sea, the breeze from the Arabian Sea, the gentle breeze from the high ranges. We all celebrate these in spite of this. In S.K. Pottekkatt also, the Vishaganyaka is the title refers to certain reference to the zodiac, which is very, very popular in Kerala, the horoscope of a maiden. She is destined to be a widow. So that is the Vishaganyaka. Whoever marries the Vishaganyaka is destined to die. Or horoscope from the perspective of the zodiac, she is destined to be a widow. So that is how the land is. fatal relationship with the land. Man's fatal relationship with the land. In spite of the fact that the migrant, the internal migrant, the people who migrate from the middle part of the land to the high ranges. So in spite of the fact that there are landslides, there are dangers, man wants to identify with the land, wants to seek the source of the life in land. This is what he celebrates in what is called Vishagannika. Or even we can have certain novels about farmers, about cultivation, about agriculture. We have Thagadi's Randilangadi. Thagadi's Randilangadi is about the destiny, the predicament of the farmers of Kutanad. Kutanad is a very popular, is popular for the cultivation of paddy, and that can be just opposed with the Premasram. So that's also about the cultivation, about the feudal hierarchy, about large scale farming, about the predicament of the farm laborers. The Randilangadi also it's about the predicament of the farmers who depended on the money lenders. So they borrowed at a higher rates of interest, cultivated the land, and after the harvest, all the borrowings they were returned, and finally the farmer got only 2 liters of paddy. That is only a meager paddy, a meager quantity of paddy is left after all the debts were cleared. So even in these novels, you can see that in spite of the suffering, in spite of misery, in spite of poverty, the Kerala farmer, the Kuttanadan farmer, he is submissive. He never seeks to any extreme action or words, but that's not the case in the northern context. And you can find this in English novels or novels written in the context of Europe or Africa. Let's take, for example, a very famous novel, a cottage of a novel, a tetralogy by Lawrence Durrell. He's a postmodernist British writer, Lawrence Durrell. Alexandria Cottage. Alexandria Cottage is Alexandria, so the landscape is Egypt. That is why it is called Alexandria Cottage. Egypt and the neighboring nations. Alexandria Cottage. It is a tetralogy. It is a quartet of 4 novels. Justin, Balthasar, Montalive, and Clee. These are 4 characters. The 4 characters, major characters: Justin, Montalive, Balthasar, Montalive, and Clee. C-L-E-A, Clee. So here Justin is one of the female protagonists, and she is considered a victim of landscape. A victim of landscape. Justin is called a victim of landscape. Thus, there are several victims of landscape in our states also, in our country also. And again, I return to Kerala. So you see, coconut. Kerala is famous for coconut trees. You know, coconut stands aloof from other trees. Stands aloof from other trees. So it is a typical Malayali, the typical Keralite. Stands aloof from others. Unaffected by what is going on in the society. There is a lukewarm response to the interactions in society, stands aloof. And Kerala is paradoxical in many respects. In Kerala, you can find, so this is a land of coconut. And in this land of coconut, you can see Coca-Cola factory manufacturing cola. And there are many shops selling cola. So what is after all the significance of tender coconut? Tender coconut, it has a new connotations, new dimensions in the present context of globalization. When cola, so our market is invaded by cola. In this context, the tender coconut is a paradigm of cultural resistance, a resistance to globalization, a resistance to market economy, a resistance to liberalization. And again, we can see the people. So what is the nature of economy in Kerala? It is an artificial economy. So in the index, in the social index, in the welfare index, Kerala stands at par with the many European welfare states. This is based on what is called an artificial economy, an economy which is a result of what is called the brain drain. So so our educated youths, they never find, they cannot find opportunities in Kerala, so they go abroad. And these youths, they are also confronted by paradoxical working conditions. Keralites work hard in everywhere in the world except in Kerala. And Kerala to them is like a nest where they often come to roost. O'Neill, for example, the American dramatist O'Neill, he considered man as a bird who flies across the sea to ever remote, ever receding nest for roosting, and falls down dead. So that's the case with the people of Kerala. They work abroad, often return to their imagined home, their nest, with a sense of nostalgia, with a sense of homesickness, with a sense of returning to the land which is more imagined than real. And they are confronted with a paradoxical working conditions, and they create an artificial economy, artificial living conditions, and they are also confronted by what can be called they always relish spectacles of distant suffering. You know, it is a term coined by Hannah Arendt. Hannah Arendt is an American Jewish American theorist, Marxist theorist. Hannah Arendt. In her work on the politics of pity, she speaks about distant suffering. So we all of us have a tendency to identify with the suffering of the people we view through the television sets. There are sufferings in different parts of the world. Let us take, for example, sufferings during the pandemic. We have seen sufferings of the people, millions of people during the pandemic. We have seen tsunami. We have seen earthquake. We have seen the sites of floods. So during the pandemic, you can see the exodus of the migrant laborers to their home states. Many of them perish on their way. We have seen these spectacles of suffering. We identify with them. We identify with them as far as they are not here. So the tragedy occurs to someone somewhere there. It occurs to them and there, not here, and not in the present, not now. So when we see people suffering around now, we never consider for them. We identify with the suffering of the people in the television set. So this is the situation. This is what I find paradoxical about the Malayali in the in the contemporary context. And see, in all say theoretical process, there are two factors. One is geography and psychography. Geography and psychography. And the best example is our concept of a nation. What is a nation? A nation is an intermediate between a geography and a psychography, a combination of geography and a psychography. In fact, psychography is essential to consolidate a geography. Psychography is essential. Even sometimes geography may not be essential. Psychography is essential to consolidate, to realize a geography. There are examples, very, very good examples in our world. And you might have heard of Palestine. Palestine is now a nation. Once it was, that is in 1976, it became a nation only in 1976. Before that, it was a nation in exile. Yasser Arafat was their leader. So he was the leader of Palestine Liberation Organization, PLO. PLO was an outfit which was in exile. They could not work in their land, in their country. And only in 1976, Palestine became a nation. So Yasser Arafat and his people had a psychography before they realized a geography. And in the Bible, you know, the story of Exodus, how say Moses led the Israelites to the promised land. The Israelites, they used to the promised land. So at the time of Moses, the Jewish nation was a nation within Egypt. It was a community. It was a nation within Egypt, and they had a psychography. They had a mental image of a nation. They had a mental image of a nation, about a nation somewhere in what is called the promised land. The promised land. And Moses liberated them, led them to the promised land, to the Israel, to the modern Israel. It was once a promised land. He led them, and he suffered, and they suffered many ordeals on their way, and they could reach there with the help of Jehovah. You know the story. The Red Sea parted ways, and they escaped from Pharaoh, and they crossed the desert and reached Israel. And in our vicinity, we have the Tibet, the Dalai Lama. The Dalai Lama was the theocratic, you know, it is a theocratic state like Vatican. Vatican is a theocratic state. Pope is ahead of the state. Likewise, Tibet is a theocratic state with the Dalai Lama as ahead of the state. Dalai Lama. Now, this Tibetan state, the Tibetan country, the nation was invaded by China. The Dalai Lama was banished. And the Dalai Lama and his supporters, so they belong what is called a theocratic state, and that theocratic state is now in exile. Then a nation itself is in exile, and the people are scattered in different parts of the world, including India. They have all a psychography. They have a psychography, and once they strive, they strive to realize the geography once. So this is how. This is the case with every thought process. There is a geography and there is a psychography. And even see, when we speak about Indian nation, nowadays it is mostly called a gendered nation, gendered discourse of nation. It is called India is called Bharat Mata. Now it is called Bharat Mata. There is a goddess, the image of a goddess, see, appearing on the map of India. So India is not the India. It was not the India. It is not the India during the time of the British colonial period. The British India, see, the first history of India was written by a British historian, James Mill. So the history is called History of British India. History of British India. The history of British India. The India consisted of India today, then Pakistan, Bangladesh, Myanmar, Nepal, Bhutan, and Afghanistan. Several nations. And these nations were separated by the colonizers themselves until in 1947, India was divided into two, India and Pakistan. And in 1971, again a new nation originated. And nations like Nepal and Bhutan, they refused to join Indian Union. And Sikkim was also a nation. Later, Sikkim dissolved or united with India. So the idea of the nation changes. The geography of the nation changes. Geography continues to change. And there is also psychography. Psychography also has to change along with the geography, and vice versa. There is also, so that was how the empire was developed during the expansion of the empire. The empire was developed. First of all, there is a psychography, expansion of psychography to develop a geography. And the gender discourse of nation, and this gender discourse of nation, there were several images related to this. So one is in 1971, Indo-Pak War, image of Shiva. Shiva was revived. There was a revival of the image Shiva. What is Shiva? Shiva is the archetypal image of violent, destructive energy. Archetypal image of violent, destructive energy. And you can find this image in Midnight's Children. In Midnight's Children, there are two children. One is born exactly at the midnight of the birth of the Indian nation, or India and Pakistan. Salim Shenai. He's a child, he's a midnight child, and the other child is born 1 minute late, and he's Shiva. And this child was born into, he followed violent ways, and Shiva incorporates all the features, all the characteristics of a destroyer. During the Indo-Pak War, and later and he is likely to moving towards more destruction during the period of the emergency in 1975-76, during the emergency. So there was a revival. There was a revival of violent destructive energy, and also now there is a revival of the what is called the gender discourse of the nation, what we call the Bharat Mata, the gender discourse of the nation. This gender discourse is not something new. You can find this gender discourse of nation in Russian literature, in Boris Pasternak novel, Dr. Shivago. Dr. Shivago, the protagonist, the female protagonist, Laura. Laura is a symbol of the purity of revolution. Purity of revolution. So revolution was like a religion to early communists. Early communists like Lenin and his comrades. Revolution was something sacred, something pure. That's why Laura was considered the symbol of the purity of revolution, and later, and that image of Mother Russia, she symbolizes Mother Russia, and this Mother Russia was trampled by the autocratic leader Stalin, who followed Lenin. Trampled. And there is a transition of the gender role. And after Stalin, Russia became the fatherland, not the motherland. So gender of the nation was not very important a few years back or during the last decade or until the last decade. The gender of the nation was not very important in Indian context, but now it is very important. Gendered discourse of the nation. And we know that the political parties in India, politicians in India, early politicians until the last decades, politicians have been invoking nationalism as a rhetoric. Even very small school children. So you take the pledge. India is our country. All Indians are our brothers and sisters. I love my country. So this is a rhetoric. Nationalism is invoked as a rhetoric often. So whenever the politicians are in trouble, they invoke nationalism as a rhetoric. Now we see nationalism is whipped up as a hysteria. I think that you remember that now there is a practice of singing nationalism in cinema halls. When some unfortunate invalid person could not rise during the nationalism was sung, he was beaten up. And you can see national anthem is how it is sung in outer context in different situations. It is whipped up, stirred up as a hysteria. People become hysteric on listening to national anthem. They come up with premonitions, predestined feelings, violent feelings. And that's how the concept of the nation undergoes changes with changes in geography, with the changes in psychography. The psychography is evolved by our context. Different factors contribute to the changes in psychography. And see, I think that you may be familiar with a person called Albert Camus. Albert, we spelled it as Albert Camus, Camus, Albert Camus. So the existentialist novelist, French novelist, Camus. And the most important ecological factor in his novel is the tropical sun. The tropical sun of French Virginia. That's often called the dark sun, the dark sun, tropical sun. Extreme hot climate in tropical French Virginia, extremely hot climate. And under this extreme hot climate, people get disoriented. The disorienting effect of tropical sun. And in his novel Outsider, the outsider, the protagonist commits a murder. A murder without motive. Murder without motive. Murder for the sake of murder. Murder as fun, as pastime. Just as children play with butterflies, he kills a man without any motive. And he was taken away by police, imprisoned, and he was sentenced to capital punishment. And he is waiting for his execution. And this situation, a person waiting for execution, waiting for his death, a healthy person waiting for his death. So he knows that when he is going to be executed, he knows when he is going to die. So that situation, Camus calls absurd. Absurd. So we all live. We never think about that. While we live, we never think about that. But this person lives. He is in the condemned cell waiting for death. He knows that he is going to be executed on such and such date. And what is his feeling? And this is dealt with in Outsider. His alienation. He said, if he has some feeling, he has some joy. That's what. And here he explains what is the meaning of life. What is the meaning of life? If that be the end of life, why should we labor? Tennyson, you may know Tennyson, Alfred Lord Tennyson, the Victorian poet. In one of his poems, Lotus, the choric song, it is part of Lotus Eaters. The story of Ulysses and his soldiers and his sailors. They visited an African place, African country called the Lotus Land. They ate lotus fruit. Lotus fruit, once you eat lotus fruit, you experience what is called a kind of blissful oblivion. You forget everything. You forget your past. You forget your family, your relations, your wife, children, your native land. A blissful oblivion. And there he asks, death be the end of life. Why should life or labor be? Why should we labor? Why should we take all trouble? Why should you attend the courses? This course FDP or you pursue PhD. Why do if that be the end of life? And there he explains what is the meaning of life. Of course, that is the end of life. We have to make our life meaningful. We have to live our life in such a way as to make it meaningful. If that is the end of life, it is meaningless. It may appear meaningless. But we have to live our life in such a way as to make it meaningful. Make it relevant. And again, we had D.H. Lawrence. You know, D.H. Lawrence, D.H. Lawrence, here I refer to a very simple story written by D.H. Lawrence, titled "The Sun," S-U-N, Sun. And this story portrays the white woman's erotic experience with the sun. A white woman falls in love with sun. Sun is an element of nature. A woman falls in love with an element of nature. Very similar to Kundi. Kundi falling in love with the sun god. Similarly, in the story Sun, the protagonist, a white woman, she falls in love with the sun. She undergoes an erotic experience, and this is discussed in D.H. Lawrence's Sun. And D.H. Lawrence, you know, there is D.H. Lawrence novel, very famous novel, Sons and Lovers. Sons and Lovers. And it's a wonderful novel. And this novel was mostly read about Oedipus complex. At least 95% of criticism about this novel is about Oedipus complex. The Oedipus complex of Paul Morrell, the protagonist. But there are several other things. And D.H. Lawrence, this novel, this is a first working class novel in English language. The first a colliery novel. Collier, you know, colliery means it is a novel about miners. Mine and miners. First a colliery novel. The Paul Morrell's father, Walter Morrell, was a miner, a collier. It's the first working class novel. It's a novel which deals with the hygiene. Hygiene is a very important factor. Hygiene. Hygiene is a theme. Hygiene often makes and breaks relationship. Walter Morrell's relationship with his wife, Gertrude, was broken because he was not fastidious. He was not hygiene. He never followed a hygiene in his personal life. Hygiene was a very important thing. And in this novel also he betrayed his Nazi sympathies. D.H. Lawrence, he expressed his Nazi sympathies in this novel, therefore he was condemned by some of the critics. But this novel expresses what is called his rootedness, man's rootedness to the soil. Soil is a source of life. You know, this certain blood, the phrase certain blood, related to soil. Soil is a source of life. It sustains life. And there are many novels which deals with the relationship with the soil, man's relationship with the soil. Perlesbach's novel, for example, The Good Earth. Man's relationship with his land. Agrarian China. Agrarian China is a landscape here. Agrarian China. Again, the Norwegian novelist Knut Hamsun's Growth of the Soil. Growth of the Soil is also about man's relationship with the land. There he invokes real and mythical landscapes. Real and mythical landscapes are invoked. Then third world concept of land. Third world concept of land is expressed by several novelists. For example, Joan Rulfo, Joan, J-U-A-N, Rulfo, R-U-L-F-O, Joan Rulfo's The Burning Plain. The burning plain is the third world concept of land. How land is destroyed, how forest is destroyed, environment is destroyed by the dominant nations, the developed nations. And many third world novelists, third world writers, playwrights writers, they also express the concept of land, man's relationship with land, third world concept of land. For example, the Nigerian playwright Ule Soyinka. Ule Soyinka's plays and novels are about the third world concept of land. So likewise, and also the Thiongo, Ngugi wa Thiongo's novels, especially the Petals of Blood. Petals of Blood, it's about the globalization, the globalized concept of land. See, the change of landscape, what we call urbanization. Urbanization brings change of landscape, consequent globalization, modernization. Similarly, there is also sea. The sea is also part of the land. We call it seascape, landscape, and we call it seascape. In foreign novels or sea-based novels, sea is more than a local. Sea is almost a character in most of these novels. For example, Conrad's sea novels, Heart of Darkness, or Melville's, American novelist Melville's novel, The Moby Dick, or in our Chemin, Tagiri's Chemin. Sea is more than a local. Sea is more than a seascape. It is a character. Sea grows into a character. And what is sea? Sea stands for several signs. Sea is a sign, a multi-layered sign. Sea stands for eternity, infinity, mystery of sea. Sea, the depth of the sea, mystery, infinity, and also eternity. Sea stands for eternity. See, man's relationship with land is also a certain spiritual context. See, when a man commits crime, he develops what is called guilt consciousness. We have characters with the guilt consciousness, characters who have transgressed, characters who have sinned. So they cannot leave the land. They are connected to the land as in an umbilical cord. An umbilical cord, an invisible umbilical cord connects the person who sinned, the person who made certain transgressions, the person who feels guilty of his commissions. Ravi, for example, Avi Vijayan's Kazakh, Ravi, he committed many sins while he was in Kasrak. And he could not, he could have saved himself. He could escape. He could leave the place. But he never left the place. He let himself be bitten by a snake and he died. He allowed himself to be bitten by the snake. That's how he dies. So in the best end, a snake, he shows his ankle, his foot to a snake, and it bites him and he dies. This is how, see, some lands, so whenever he, when he first steps in Kumankava, so that's a place the bus arrives and he steps down. When he gets down from the bus, he feels that this place has been. He has been familiar with the place. So though he visits the place for the first time, he thinks that, he feels that this place has been familiar to him. So there is some invisible, some inexplicable connection between land and the character. Similarly, Herman Melville's novel, The Scarlet Letter. The Scarlet Letter, it is about adultery. A priest's adultery with a married woman. A priest is then entered into an adulterous relationship with a woman, a married woman, and had a child. They had a child, Pearl. And it was a Puritan society. The Puritan society condemned the woman as an adulteress. So in those days, it was a Puritan period. The condemned woman had to wear, she was forced to wear a letter A on her coat. The letter A stands for adultery. She is an adulteress. Whenever people see the woman wearing a letter A on her jacket, they immediately recognize that she is not an ordinary woman, she is an adulteress, a fallen woman. So that's a story. So here the Arthur Dimmesdale is the priest. And he was transferred, but he never left that place. He was suffering from the sin, and he dies at the place. And this is discussed by several novelists, several writers. Friedrich Dürrenmatt. Friedrich Dürrenmatt is a Swiss novelist and playwright. And most of his writings are about man's invisible, inexplicable relationship to land. And and let us come to the Indian context. In the Indian context, we know, see, we have, so in Indian classics, in most of the classics portray what is called a very hospitable, very amiable habitat. Habitat, that is an ecosystem where different beings coexist. That's a habitat, ecohabitat, ecologically balanced system. And the best example is Kumarasambhavam. Kumarasambhavam, how Shiva was described. Kumarasambhavam, the story. Initially, Shiva was alone. He was in meditation. How he was described? He was described as the deity, the devotee, the officiating priest, the land, the sky, the fragrance, the fire, and oblation. Everything is Shiva. All these elements coexist in Shiva. He is deity as well as devotee. He is land and sky. He is fire and fragrance. He is a priest and oblation. Everything is Shiva. This is how Shiva was invoked. And see, many Shankara, for example, Shankara follows a tradition used by Kalidasa. In Kalidasa, you can find what is called a landscaping body. Landscaping body. That means a landscape is an analogy is drawn into a landscape and a body, a comparison between a landscape and a body. This is something very, you can find this landscaping. Body is landscaped. See, then Kanai Kunjiraman landscaped body in Trivandrum, and then Veli, in Veli garden, a woman's body is landscaped there. I think here also a garden, there was a garden, a woman's body was landscaped here also. Some controversy arises a few years. So our body is landscaped. And that's a tradition, a classical tradition initiated by Kalidasa. Kalidasa's Meghadut or Megha Sandesham, the protagonist is a Yaksha, and he was banished, and he sent a message. He sent a message through clouds. It's called a message sent through cloud. That is why it is called a Megha Dut or Megha Sandesha. There he describes Ujjain. Ujjain is a landscape. Ujjain landscape is compared to the body of his beloved. Where female body is drawn into an analogy with the Ujjain landscape, beginning from the hills to the plains. There is no seashore. Beginning from the hills, then forests, then say meadows, then rivers, and finally to the river banks. This pattern is what we call landscaping body. And this was followed in Malayalam literature, in also in early Malayalam literature, there is what is called Maniprabala. In Maniprabala literature also there is Sandesha Kavya was there, and also there was Charita. Charita means it is story. Different types of story, that is Charita. So this is there are Sandesha Kavyas and Charitas are there in Maniprabala literature. Maniprabala literature is often condemned for its explicit treatment of the female body, and women are portrayed as bodies, simply as bodies. They are denied a personhood. They are denied identity, individuality in Maniprabala literature. And Maniprabala literature also, the female body is graphically narrated in terms of landscape. From what is called a Keshadi Pada Varnana. That is, the woman's body is narrated, described from the head to the foot. And this is graphically narrated, described in erotic terms in Maniprabala literature. And Shankara also did this but not in a, and we call this in visual culture, we call this what is called a male gaze, a term coined by Laura Mulvey. Laura Mulvey coined this term in the context of narrative cinema. Narrative cinema, there is Hollywood narrative films. Hollywood commercial films are generally called narrative cinema. In the case of narrative cinema, she coined the term male gaze. That is, the women are misrepresented in such a way as to gratify male sexual fantasies. In Hollywood's narrative films or Hollywood commercial films, women are misrepresented in such a way as to arouse, as a stir up, or as to satisfy male sexual fantasies. This is what is called male gaze. And this landscaping body is also a form of male gaze. Shankara did this in a metaphysical level in Lalita Sahasranama. In Lalita Sahasranama, the epithets, that's a nama, it is 1,000 names of Devi. goddess Lilita, the goddess of education, goddess of learning, Lilita. And several other attributes are also given to her. Primarily, the goddess of learning. And I think the names are named 17 to 51. 17 to 51 describes, it's a Kesadipada Varnana of her body. Her body is landscaped. Her body is described in terms of fruits, in terms of flowers, in terms of landscape. See, and but it is not in a manner done by Kalidasa. Shankara looked at Devi at a metaphysical level. This is what is called a tantric erotics. This kind of erotics is in Vedanta. In Vedanta, this erotics, it is not the erotic of the common man, just like the pornographic or Manipravala literature, or Kalidasa's plays. It is a erotic, which may be erotic, but it is a metaphysical level, because he looks at Devi from a metaphysical level. He is beyond all emotions. Shankara was beyond all emotions when he viewed Devi following him at the Kedarnath, at the Himalayas. When Devi followed him at the Himalayas, he looks at her, and he was in a state, elated state. He transcended all emotions. He was in a metaphysical level. So when we graphically analyze this, you can find that he was familiar with the tradition followed by Kalidasa in his Kumara Sambhavam or in Mekhaduda, where the protagonist, the female protagonist body is landscaped. And so in Saundarya Lahari also, not a landscaping body, but an eco-aesthetic view of Devi, an eco-aesthetic, not landscaping, but how an ecologically balanced goddess. You can find an ecologically balanced goddess in Saundarya Lahari. A goddess who is situated in a balance of what is called a nature and culture. Nature and culture. How nature and culture are balanced in a situation, and in such a situation you can see Devi in all splendor of see lighting, then fragrance, temple in the situation of the Deeparadhana, of the temple. You can see how Devi is decorated. Situation, that view, that grand view, the grandeur of Devi appearing in a situation where nature and culture are balanced. But in the West, it is, for example, Walt Whitman. Walt Whitman is a poet who explored the ecological significance in his poetry. And the title of his poetry is called Leaves of Grass. Leaves of Grass. And there are several editions of Leaves of Grass. And whenever he writes poems, he adds to the collection. And the collection gradually grows into thousands of poems. There is only a single title. When usually a poet publishes his poems under different titles, but he has only a single title, and there are only several editions. And the poem continues to grow, just as nature grows, just as vegetation grows, just as leaves grow. Leaves grow. Poetry also grows. Poems grows. Poems are added to their reservoir. the organism. In his view, he has an ecological view of poetry. Poetry is like a living organism. Poetry is like a living organism in which it continuously grows. A living organism which continuously grows. In a poem, poem is a species. Poem is an organism. In an organism, every part of the body is connected to every other part. That's why when you are wounded in some part of the body, you have a pain in entire, uneasiness in entire body. That's his view. An ecological view of poetry, an ecological view of a poem. Poem is compared to an organism, a vegetation. And he uses in some of his poems, there is a section of poems called a calamus poems. Calamus is a tall reed-like plant, where a calamus stands for gay relations. Gay, G-A-Y, gay relations. Calamus poems deals with the love between men. It need not be explicitly or overtly sexual. It can be even asexual love also. So there is another type of landscaping. In the Indian context, Vastu. Vastu Vidya. Vastu Vidya is a reverse process of landscaping. It is figuring landscape. OD is engrossed in a landscape, figuring landscape. So Vastuvidya, it is a kind of aesthetic. It is architectural aesthetic. It is part of eco-aesthetic. So Indian architecture is sustainable. It is sustainable architecture, that is ecological architecture, ecologically based architecture. There, a figure, that's a Vastu Purusha, is figured into the landscape where a habitat, a residence, a house is constructed. And so there are certain other types of land. See, in the contemporary context, it's a third world country, so we are all concerned about the kind of resistance to globalization, resistance to neo-imperialism, resistance to what is called neo-colonialism. So different types of new exploitations designed by the developed nations. So I told you in the last lecture that the developed nations try to monopolize the world, try to colonize the world through new methods. And that's why there is new imperialism or neo-colonialism. So one method I had told you is a monopoly of digital technologies. In this context, the third world nations, all the third world nations are concerned with the resistance. And there are many writers who landscape resistance. Resistance can be expressed in terms of landscape. And the best example is Soyinka, the Nigerian playwright Soyinka. So he creates images. See, in his place, there are two types of conflicts. One is a conflict between progress and tradition. Progress and tradition. Progress is development. It is a euphemistic term. It is a euphemistic term for modernization, urbanization, globalization. Say everything, every kind of destruction is carried out for development. Now there is a controversy of K-Rail. K-Rail it is also about a destruction, destruction of nature, destruction of environment, destruction of the land. So it is not sustainable, ecologically sustainable, or even economically sustainable. So development is a discourse, and television is a medium that is appropriated to spread, to distribute, to disseminate, to market the discourse of development and progress. And it is euphemistically called progress, progress and tradition. The people who are against development, they are called, they are traditional. They are traditional. They resist progress. And another is about modernization. Modernization is against tradition and modernization. So Soyinka always stands for tradition, against progress, against modernization. And it creates obstruction to development, obstruction to progress in terms of, say, flora and fauna. Flora, flora, animals, say, plants and animals, or landscapes. Landscape like, see, small hills, hillocks, so meadows, so such lands, see, marshy places. See, these trees, certain types of trees. So these trees or all types of flora, fauna, their used images are used to express resistance to what is called progress or modernity. And again, these images of flora and fauna, they reappear. These are all ecological images. These images reappear in what is called edible fiction. There is a, edible fiction about food, about eating habits, about preparation of food, about recipes, about the benefits of the food. This is called edible fiction. Edible fiction. And we have also culinary fiction or culinary narratives. There are also non-fiction that's why we call it culinary narratives. It consists of fiction as well as non-fiction. Culinary narratives. Travel narratives also, there are two items. In travel narratives, there is a landscape as well as food. Landscape is described and food is also described. So if you read Pottekad, you can see how landscape is described, how the people are described, their culture, festivals are described, along with the different types of food available to them. Or Hemingway's Movable Feast. Movable Feast is also a travelogue. There he describes about it is the different types of wine or liquor, the liquor available, wine, or different types of beverages available in different parts of the world he visited. Movable Feast. And I conclude with a reference to Thinna Poetics. Thinna, have you heard of Thinna? Thinna Poetics is part of I have forgotten that name. His name is it's part of an ancient Tamil grammar. No. The book is I have forgotten it. So It's part of it. It was originally published as part of Tamil grammar. Thina poetics. Thina. There are two types of Thina. What is see? It's Tamil poetry. Sangha poetry is divided into Akam and Puram. Akam. There are two types of Thina. Thina, it is this word, from this word, the Malayalam word Thinna. Thinna is a word. Thinna means courtyard. Courtyard. Comes from Thinna. There are two types of Thinna. One is Akam Thinna and other is Puram Thinna. Akam Thinna deals with the emotions, sentiments, feelings. All inner events, interior events. The Tamil book is called, originally is called Tolkappiyam. Tolkappiyam is a Tamil, ancient Tamil grammar. Tolkappiyar. Tolkappiyar was a author. That's why it is called a Tolkappiyam. And Thinna Poetics is part of Tolkappiyam. That is a grammar book. And this poetics was part of grammar then. So Akam Thinna deals with everything that is internal, interior events, inner emotions, feelings, thoughts, dreams, hallucinations, everything comes under Thinna. See, Akam Thinna. Puram Thinna is about something taking place outside courtyard, outside home. It can be travel, adventure, war. See, and all the occupations, most of the occupations are carried out outside. All occupations are carried out outside. They are Puram Thinna. And there are 5 types of Thinna. We call it Aim Thinai. Aim Thinai. Aim means 5. 5 Thinnas. There are 5 Thinnas. What are the 5 Thinnas? These Thinnas are related to landscapes. 5 types of landscape. There are 5 types of landscape related to 5 types of emotions and situations in which the protagonists are placed. They are, one is Kurinchi. Kurinchi. Kurinchi stands for hills. And in love poetry, that means in Agam poetry mainly deals with the love. Mainly deals with the love. In Agam poetry, this stands for union of lovers. Kurinchi hill stands for union of lovers in Agam poetry. Second is Mullai. Mullai forest land. This stands for domesticity, domestic life. And also anxious waiting for lover, anxious waiting. And also domesticity. That is when the lovers united, they settle down in marriage. Domesticity is also represented through forest, that is Mullai. Then Marutam. Marutam is cultivable land. That means fields. Fields that can be cultivated, farmlands. Farmland stands for infidelity or sulking. That means a relationship outside a normal relationship. That is infidelity. When either of the lover is unfaithful, that is infidelity. Or they sulk, they vacillate in love. Vacillations in love, that's also represented through Marutam. That is cultivated field, farm. And fourth one is Palai. Palai is marshy land, wasteland, land that cannot be cultivated, barren land. It stands for elopement. Elopement, elope. The lovers elope from society, from family. Elopement and also separation. That means separation from parents. the lovers are separated, that is the boy and the girl, they are separated from parents. And that's represented through Palay, wasteland, marshy land. And finally, Naithal. Naithal is sea coast, beach, sea coast. Coast, sea coast. Seashore, that is Naithal. Naithal stands for separation of lovers. Separation of lovers. So there are 5 landscapes, and they have 5 situations of the lovers. And these landscapes, they are not simply landscapes. They are also emotions. The landscape, they stir up certain emotions. They create certain emotions. The landscape, the situation of the landscape or the image of the landscape brings or stir up emotions in the lovers. So any Akkam poetry can be analyzed from using 5 landscape. For example, Vailapalli's poem about domestic life, Kannir Padam. Kannir Padam, Kannir Padam, cultivated land. Marudam is about infidelity, sulking, vacillation, all these things. Kannir Padam, so it is a field filled with water. So not with water. Usually fields are filled with water. This field, Vailapalli's field is filled with tears. Tears of the the tears of the woman here, Kannir Padam. Or it is visible. Maybe the invisible. He always, from autobiographical point of view, he store all the invisible tears in his heart. Vailapalli stored all his tears in his heart, and that is invisible. Marutam. Or why say Chemmin became a tragedy? From this point of view, why Chemmin became a tragedy? Kartama and Parikutti, they met where? They met at an inappropriate landscape. For the union of lovers, they had to meet at Kurinji. But they they were at a Naithal. Naithal is a landscape for separation of lovers. When the lovers meet at the appropriate place, these emotions are evoked. If they meet at inappropriate landscape, the emotions are not invoked. So the emotions must be appropriate to landscape and vice versa. A landscape must be appropriate to the emotions. This how, see, and all these images, they are related to what is called ecological registers. There are several registers related to plants, animals, registers. Registers is a specialized kind of linguistic terms. Registers, ecological registers. Register, REGISTERS. Registers, there are registers, professional registers are also there. Registers used by doctors, by mechanics. Mechanics use a special kind of registers. Similarly, there are ecological registers. Registers related to farming, fishing, harvest, rain. Nyatuvela. Similar, there is also Iduvapadi. And there are terms related to rain and also related to sea, the tides. low tide, high tide, and also the movement of the moon. Movement of the moon is related to ecology, not sun. Movement of the moon. Movement of that is the lunar eclipse. That's the lunar movements are related to sun, especially women, related to the women subculture. There are several registers, many ecological registers are there, and that's part of what we call eco-linguistics. Eco-linguistics mainly related to registers, ecological registers. With this, I conclude. Thank you.